Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barbara Wilson, and I am the Director of Collaboration and Community Partnerships for the Presbytery of Chicago. So we're pleased to have you with us today, and I'm a double alum of McCormick, so welcome.
Thank you so much. Today, we want to focus on a conversation about food security. Before we get into that, I think it's pretty important to contextualize what we're dealing with. As of last month, according to the Chicago Tribune, the number of Illinois workers seeking unemployment insurance benefits last week topped 201,000. In all, more than 493,000 have filed initial claims for unemployment in the past 3 weeks in Illinois. So that's 1 in every 12 workers, which means that perhaps 1 in every 12 of those persons now has a concern about being able to put food on their tables. That's reflective of the national situation. As of May 8th, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor, total non-farm payroll employment fell by 20.5 million in April, and the unemployment rate rose to 14.7%. All of this is within the last 30 days, at least, and it is primarily impacted by COVID-19. I think it's important for us to contextualize what we're talking about today in terms of this is a local situation that has national implication. And so we just kind of want to contextualize the conversation for a few reasons. First of all, to help us understand the wider picture, but to also kind of help people recognize here in Chicago and wherever else we are connecting that this is an issue that we need to be talking about now, and that this issue has a historical background. And as we know that today is related to tomorrow, this today, what we do today, how we care for our communities, put food on tables now, impacts the history that will be told in the future. And so I think it's just wanted to kind of put those pieces out there for us to help us to think contextually. And we have some amazing speakers today who are going to help us do that. As usual, we have someone who's going to talk about kind of a broad view and understanding exactly what's going on within the national and local context. And for that, we have Dr. Angela Odoms-Young. She's the Associate Professor of Kinesiology and Nutrition from the UIC Institute for Health Research and Policy. Not only do we want to provide an overview of what's going on, but we also need to talk about, now that we know what's happening, how can we get involved? And for that, we have Reverend Dr. Valerie Tony Parker with the Chicago Food Depository. And she's going to talk about some of the options about how to get food to people. And for those who are interested in getting involved with getting food to people, she's going to share a bit about that. And furthermore, because we are committed to theological education that is immediately engaged and relevant, we also want to address this from a faith perspective. And for that, we have Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagan Banks, the Executive Director of A Just Harvest. She is also an adjunct professor whom I've had the privilege of teaching with here at McCormick. And she's going to bring that faith piece to us. So I'd like to begin with Dr. Angela Odoms-Young. Dr. Angela, Chicago has multiple food deserts, and they have been an issue for a while. Can you talk about Chicago's history around food disparity and its health legacy in particular communities? And also what happens psychologically when entire communities have endured generations of food disparity and insecurity?
Okay, great. And I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you so much for the invitation. Unfortunately, this is a topic that I talk about often because it still persists. I'm going to frame it because in Chicago, when you look at those that are at greatest risk, both for food insecurity as well as low food access, Black and Latinx communities really are at the center of that. but such a large percentage of Black communities and Black residents in Chicago live in low food access communities. I'm going to frame it in the context of Black communities, but it has broader implications. Right now, although African Americans are about a third of the population in Chicago, 80% live in low food access communities, which is significant. So really, when we think about this, we have a center at UIC for structural violence. We kind of frame this in the context of what we think of as structural violence. So those are really policies and policies in environments that are violent. A lot of times we think about kind of that one-on-one violence, but really policies can be violent, communities can be violent, and cause trauma where the context is not supportive of wellness. This was a quote that we had in a study some time ago from a study that we did in Inglewood, actually, and somebody made this comment. They said, you have to go all the way out to where the white people live to find everything, even a better supermarket. So when we think about this was probably 10 years ago. Unfortunately, the picture still looks the same. We haven't seen a great increase in food access in those same communities. It's like we're telling the same story. In spite of that, we have a lot of advocates at the community level. Inglewood is an excellent example of that, of people organizing and mobilizing to change food access. But again, when we think about structural violence, we have to really change those policies and funding structures, environments that help support people within communities to make a difference. So this was a map from some time ago. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of this has continued to persist. We know that many African-American communities, primarily communities on the West and South Side, don't have access to retail. We have seen some increase in retail across the city, but not a net increase in those communities that are most in need. When you also, and this is a data, and I know Dr. Valerie is going to talk a little bit about opportunities at the Greater Chicago Food Depository. This is data to look at food insecurity in communities. So one, we have low food access in communities, and then when you overlay food insecurity is where people feel like they're going to run out of food and not have money to buy more. So they're worried about that concern. So that's an economic indicator, where food access is a geographic indicator of access. We have a layering in the same community. So you have low access where people have to travel outside of their community. And then you have this low economic condition of food insecurity, where people have a worry that they may run out of food and not have money to buy more. And in some of those communities, including the South suburbs like Robbins, you see 45% of people feel that they may run out of food and not have money to buy more. So now you have this layering of disadvantage. This is not new. And although many people talk about food deserts, quote unquote, we don't like kind of the term desert. Some people say food swamps, but this idea of low food access, this was really raised in the late 1960s to the late 70s. There was even a U.S. House of Representatives report called Consumer Problems of the Poor, and this was called the Ghetto Grocery Studies, I'm sorry. So even in 1968, and I'm proud to say I was born in 1968, if you think 50 plus years, we are still talking about this structural violence that happens in communities of color related to access. Even though we think about this as a new conversation, it has been one that has existed over many years. Even going back to slavery, and I'll talk just briefly about that, and I want to make sure that I'm mindful of the time. So what do we have? We have low access, low affordability, high exposure to food marketing, which creates cycles of food deprivation and overeating, and then high levels of stress. When people cannot get access to food, or when they feel like they're going to run out of food because they don't have the financial means, that creates stress. And what kind of stress does that create? Food insecurity is a multi-dimensional concept. It includes psychological aspects, social, a managed process, as well as physiological aspects. So the psychological, people have food anxiety. They have feelings of deprivation because they lack choice. This is really, we've done some studies of parents that have experienced food insecurity, and some of that food-related parenting that we engage in, when people have that psychological deprivation and they can't provide food for their children, that is a source of psychological stress and food anxiety. Then also it's social. We engage many times in social interactions. I'm sorry, I think I kind of went back. We engage in social interactions around food. And so when people don't have food, they may feel powerlessness, guilt, or shame, and social exclusion, because a lot of our social interactions are around food and meals, and it becomes a deviation in the US context, a deviation from social norms. Sometimes people have to engage in a managed process where they have to make really significant trade-offs, delaying bill payments, sending children to friends or relatives' homes, selling things, trying to manage food assistance without potentially a lot of help or support. And then the physiological, which we are probably most familiar with, this idea of experience of a physical sensation of hunger in nutritionally inadequate diets that result in poor health outcomes. So when we think about structural violence in this context, food is really economic disinvestment. It's not an individually focused or just focused on individuals and families, but when you disinvest from communities, this has a psychological impact on communities, a traumatic aesthetic, so to speak, when you pass stores that have been closed, or just the physical appearance of these stores are not reinforcing and supportive. And so yet we have this economic disinvestment in communities. And then food has long been, particularly in communities of color, a means of oppression and discrimination. And I won't go through this based on time, but again, the biggest environmental impact that happened, at least in African-American communities, it started from slavery on. It's not something new when we think about communities now, that food is a means for how oppression and discrimination happen, either through access to stores or lack of access to stores, presence of stores in communities, who owns the stores, how is your food controlled. All of that is linked to power and social structure in communities. So I'll stop there. But that's just to sort of provide a little bit of a background.
If you wanted to continue a little bit more, you have 4 more minutes if you'd like.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I think COVID-19 has really brought out how serious this issue is in these particular communities. One is we see that disproportionate impact on certain communities as compared to others when it comes to COVID deaths. We know that people have everything from low-income workers needing to be on the front lines within the food industry and exposure, people needing to travel outside of their communities, sometimes on public transportation to access basic needs. So when we talk about COVID-19, you raised the unemployment issue, and rates right now of food insecurity are really it's a mirror to that unemployment. So we're seeing rates that potentially are double or even triple that we saw before, some estimates, particularly in families with children. So part of when you look at this, it's not just food, it's not just nutrients. It really is rooted in social and structural determinants and conditions that help people live a high quality life. So and I'll stop there.
That was so eye-opening, right? Because I did start with the unemployment rates because that was the first place that I went to, because I think no money, no food. What was amazing to me about what you shared, and I wrote it down, food insecurity as a multidimensional concept, right? Mm-hmm. So to really kind of paint a broad picture to understand it's not just not having money, not being able to go to the grocery store, but that it has psychological implications, social implications. But then you also mentioned, which, forgive me, I hadn't even got clear about this, right? So when we think about food insecurity, most of the times we're thinking about what we don't have, right? As consumers, what we're not able to access. But also, I think it was important that you also acknowledge that COVID has created an additional layer to food insecurity in terms of the persons who work for food service production, right? That's a level of insecurity, because not only are they endangered because maybe they made job cuts, but even if they are going, they're endangering themselves, right? They're because of the way the manufacturing plants are, they're close quarters, not able to do social distancing. That then we think about the food chain, but we're not thinking about the people involved in the food chain, which makes it more than a food chain. Right? These are people, human lives. So thank you so much for that broad social, psychological piece, and also kind of helping us think historically, right? Because that was also the piece that you took it back to. I was struck by food as food discrimination as a form of oppression, right? So thank you so much. Well, I'm interested in hearing more about what you're going to have to share.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Dr. Valerie Tony Parker. With the Chicago Food Repository. So my first question for you is to kind of just talk about how it's one thing to know about food insecurity, which is what Dr. Angela helped us get clear about, but are there also resources that individuals can access? What are some of the ways that individuals and organizations can get involved in responding to the rising need for food?
Crumpton, for having me representing the Greater Chicago Food Depository. If you would help me with my slides, I can give our listeners an opportunity to learn a little bit more in detail about what the Food Depository does in terms of meeting the needs of those in our communities, and talk a little bit about how they can get involved. And as you're getting that up, I appreciate Dr. Angela laying out kind of some historical context when she especially when we talk about COVID-19 as an additional layer. When we think about food resourcing and food sourcing at the Greater Chicago Food Depository, which is one of the things we do, COVID-19 has had an impact on our ability to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. If we could go to the next slide, please, Dr. Crumpton. Just to let people kind of know what our mission statement is. The Greater Chicago Food Depository is really focused on the distribution of food to our community in part. It's a two-part strategy, getting nutritious food. And I think that's really important to understand. Fruits and vegetables, proteins, milk, all of those things that one needs for a healthy and balanced diet versus snacks and other food-like items, but that really don't speak to the need for our communities to be healthy. Second part of that mission statement is really around striving to end hunger in our community. And that really is our advocacy work. We have a part of our organization that focuses on matters like SNAP and PFAP, Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program, the census, because if we're not counted places, then it makes it difficult for us to be represented in places. Additionally, we have activities such as Lobby Day. So there is a two-part strategy that really helps us to focus on the needs of those in our community. In terms of our programs, and what we do for the community in the next slide. We not only deliver food to our partners and work on advocacy, but we also have workforce development. That's another way by which people can become self-sufficient in terms of their ability to care for themselves in terms of being able to purchase food and not solely rely on other benefits. And so we have a 14-week culinary program that does just that with some of our students who may have been justice involved or who may come from different walks of life where they may have met with different kinds of challenges in life. The next thing that we do is we have produce mobiles where we go out into our community. We have over 700 partner agencies with whom we work in Cook County, and we take produce mobiles to these communities where people can go to these locations, the pantry sites, and shop, if you will, off of the produce mobile for healthy fruits and vegetables. And there's a bit of dignity that goes along with being able to select what kind of food that you want versus being just handed a bag and told this is what you'll have. We often hear the references from the 70s, and Dr. Odom-Jung probably all know about this, the government cheese and all of those kinds of things. And so what we want to do is dispel this myth that because people are hungry, they have to be treated with dignity as well. We spend a lot of time working on programs for children, where our after-school programs, our weekend and our summer lunch bus to provide nutritious food for children. Because what we also know is breakfast at the Bell and other programs are probably the only meal many of our children get throughout the day. So we provide breakfast, we provide lunch, and even with the schools closing, we have been working with CPS and the City of Chicago to ensure that there are safe locations for children and their families to get meals for the children in the absence of being able to be in school. We also have another component that focuses on older adults, those who have particular healthcare needs and are unable sometimes to be able to make market themselves. Will we provide fresh foods and stable shelf items for them at retirement communities? We're also working with hospitals and clinics to identify what are some of the needs of particular folks who have health needs, and how can we make sure that they have the right kinds of nutritious meals as well. We work with Jesse Brown and Edward Hines VA hospitals. We have food pantries throughout the week there as well. Same as the mobile pantries, the produce mobile. It enables veterans to come and select which items they'd like from a host of different offerings of fruits, vegetables, meats, dairy products, so that they can take the food home and prepare it as they like. Again, a dignity for those who have fought so hard to make sure that we have some liberties. And one of the ones that's really important, and this is a part of our second half of our mission, is the benefit outreach team. We do a lot of work on SNAP benefits, ensuring people have access to SNAP benefits. And one good piece of news that we learned yesterday through the work of our advocacy team is that starting in June, starting June 2nd, which will be a permanent feature for those receiving SNAP, they'll be able to order groceries online. Now, why is that important? Dr. Odom-Jung kind of laid it out for us, the inequity that has been a result of systemic racism in our country. And part of what we do is we try to look through everything at the food depository with an equity lens. Dr. Odom-Jung talked about the risk of going out and grocery shopping, especially for Black and Brown people in communities where they must travel on buses, or they have to go to particular kinds of stores that don't necessarily offer them the kinds of food that they should have a right to have. And so being able to order your food online through Walmart or Amazon is leveling the playing field to a certain degree for our SNAP recipients. People may wonder, if you go to the next one, Dr. Crumpton, I think we'll talk just a little bit about how we're kind of navigating this through the COVID-19 era or experience. We're using our existing distribution networks. 70% of our partners continue to distribute food. Unfortunately, some of our pantries have had to close doors because, as we say, little, 80 some odd year old Miss Johnson, who may be the only coordinator at that pantry, she's at risk for the attracting the virus or contracting the virus. And so we don't want her in that situation. And so she's had to close her pantry. So several of them have, but we still have 70% of our pantries continuing to distribute food. Now, where there is not active distribution, we have pre-packed food boxes with the essential shelf-stable items, excuse me, also to be supplemented by the produce mobile that we can get out into the community. COVID-19 has had a deep impact on how many boxes that we've prepared. I think if you've watched some of the news, we have the whole floor of the United Center covered with pre-packed boxes ready to distribute to the community. In fact, last month we distributed 40,000 of those pre-packed boxes, and this month alone we've doubled them. So needless to say, the need is deep, and it will only get deeper as long as this crisis and recovering from this crisis is a part of what we are experiencing. We also are investing in the agency networks. We're launching money by providing grants to help agencies get up to speed so that, for example, if they are a partner agency who historically has just delivered shelf-stable items because they don't have cold storage, we'll work with them through this grant process to ensure that they have cold storage. And what does that mean? That means now they can take meat, they can now take produce and have that available as offerings for those in the community. Again, a high demand for connecting to SNAP and WIC. When COVID-19 first hit, our call volume exponentially increased. We had to add some temporary staff just to take the calls for people who were inquiring about SNAP benefits. It's leveled off, but it is still at a higher rate than we had experienced from year over year. We also look to close the food gaps with new partnerships. We're reaching out to different community partners to identify ways that we can meet their needs. These ideas are still ongoing, but whether it's a nursing facility, whether it's a healthcare facility, whether it's working with an agency that has children's programming, wherever the need is, those are where we're looking to identify new partnerships. And finally, on this point, again, at the foundation of it all is the planning and decisions that we make are rooted in racial equity, looking through the lens of racial equity, whether it's how food gets distributed, who gets the food that we distribute, where the grant money goes, how we continue to advocate in our advocacy group. All things are looked through an equity lens. Even we have supplier diversity as part of our strategic initiative. So even the organizations that we partner with to prepare meals, we're looking at them to see, are they a part of the Black and Brown community for which most of this food is going, because those are most of the folks in our community who are impacted. People obviously want to get involved, and there are quite a few ways that people can support the food depository. Obviously, continued financial support is always welcome. There are many levels of donating that are welcome. And so people are always welcome to go to our site to donate, not just for the COVID-19 response, but to the general operating budget, which allows us to purchase meals and purchase food rather for our community. Why is this important? I think I said at the outset, part of where we get our food, some of it is food resourcing. For example, we work with Starbucks to retrieve food that is at the end of the day that would otherwise be tossed out from their locations. With Starbucks closing their doors over this COVID-19 response, a lot of our shelters are unable to get those meals that otherwise we would be able to provide for them. There's also been some stress in the supply chain. And by that, we mean working with the grocery stores that have historically donated food Now that food is in high demand for the regular consumer to go in and purchase the food, which makes donating the food from the grocery store partners a little more stressful. For every dollar, I'll get to that. So donating is always a wonderful way for people to get involved. Another way is volunteering. Monday, Tuesday through Saturday, we have 2 sessions a day, one in the morning that begins at 9 o'clock, one in the afternoon that begins at 1 o'clock, 9 a.m. and 1 o'clock. And we have appropriate social distancing and all of the precautions to ensure people are safe. But here's where people can do one of a couple things, repacks. We get thousands of pounds of beans, for example, kidney beans, black beans. And so those thousands of pounds need to be reappropriated to smaller bags so that we can put in pre-packed boxes, or so that we can take to the pantries as a part of what they offer residents to select from for their meals. The other thing that we're doing is we're still packing these emergency boxes, and so with shelf-stable items. Being able to come either as an individual or come collectively as a group would be welcome. Without our volunteers, it makes it extremely difficult for us to meet the needs of our communities. The third opportunity is to host a virtual food drive. We historically have had food drives, and you've probably seen the barrels at the holiday time where people can come and put food in for us to collect and resort here. But with COVID-19, our focus has been shifting from the food drive to the virtual food drive. For every dollar that we receive, it allows us to buy 3 meals. So our buying power is greater through that than having people go to the grocery store and purchase food and then deliver it. And then a final way that people can become involved, because we know social media has a broad and deep reach, is to sign up to be a social ambassador. And by doing that, they're really signing up to share social media content about advocacy work, about the work that the Greater Chicago Food Depository does. So that's another way to keep before people the needs of our communities and the work that the Greater Chicago Food Depository is engaged in. I'll pause right now. I think I've covered everything, Dr. Crumpton, and hopefully I have not sped through my time.
No, we actually have a few minutes, but I do want to highlight a couple of pieces that I thought were really insightful. The first thing I am drawn to is what you were saying about dignity and choice, right? The importance of making sure that we meet people's needs, but that it's not simply transactional.
Correct. One of the things before COVID-19 is on these produce mobiles, we would also introduce new kinds of vegetables, for example, to the people in the community. So for example, we would have beets, and you would hear people say, well, I don't know about beets. And we know the nutritional value beets provides. So to accompany them, we have a nutrition education component where we would provide information about what the nutritional value of the beets are, but also recipes. And so then we would talk with them a little bit about, well, this is how you cook the beet, and encourage them to at least take something and try it. So that's another part of the dignity is providing it through education as well.
That's so powerful. One other piece that I also heard very clearly is the power of collaboration, right? And sharing resources. I think there was a piece where you mentioned that because some things are happening, you have to do some other things differently, right? Like how normally people do food drives, but you're letting them know that there's a matching program that for dollars done differently,
yes,
there's more access.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and so, yes, that and just getting people in terms of the volunteer experience who typically have come as groups to do a repack session, kind of reacclimating them to the more immediate need of preparing emergency boxes just in case we can't get food from the USDA or the food is short, not coming as quickly. We have some food coming now from TFAP. And we are CFAP, all of the wonderful acronyms we use here. The coronavirus food assistance program. And we are working with partner agencies, and you can find all of this on the website, to have, 20-pound box of protein, 20-pound box of fruits, 20-pound box of fruits and vegetables, dairy products, and milk, all provided through the USDA. Because remember now, farmers are impacted by this as well. And we've seen where farmers have sometimes had to destroy food because there was no supply chain to get the food to the places where they're needed. So we're working with the USDA on those types of initiatives as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So insightful.
Thank you.
I think what you offer us is a broad view and opportunities for ways for folks to get involved. But we also have the gift of having one of your partners on with us today from the Chicago, from A Just Harvest, Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagan Banks. And she's able to speak not only as a partner organization, but I think tying into this dignity piece, she's also able to speak kind of about theologically, what does it mean to think about community and food and notions of abundance? So we're actually going to start with a brief introduction to what A Just Harvest looks like right now and how they're doing that work. And then Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagan Banks will go ahead and talk about notions of scarcity and abundance. Is that even a possibility to think about abundance during a time like this? I love that. One of the hashtags for Just Harvest is a piece about love and that no one will go hungry. Reverend Dr. Marilyn, my question for you is, in the face of all of this, is there any possibility of a place for a theology of abundance in times like this?
So, yes, thank you, Dr. Crumpton, and thank you, Dr. Wilson, for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. It's a very important conversation. Yes, definitely there is a place for a theology of abundance. And I would say that COVID-19 has not only caused us to have to wear masks, but has also caused us to take our masks off. Our mask of shame, our mask of guilt, and our mask of separateness, right? Some folks know my story, but I've been hungry. I've gone days without eating. And I promised that my kids would never go hungry. And I came to seminary and ran into some financial constraints when I first got here. And we ended up having to go to a food pantry and really struggling with what it means to say yes to God's call and then end up at a food pantry, right? And then, but worked really hard and well, I don't want to say worked hard because this is not about working hard. But anyway, was able to get past that. And again, promised that my children would not experience hunger. And then my grandbabies have experienced hunger. And so just realizing just how close this issue is to my heart and to my own spirit. But understanding that the idea around abundance is definitely connected to an understanding of respect and dignity for our own humanity, but for our brothers and our sisters. And that's the way we choose to operate. So, but, you know, I want to share a little bit about where that idea of abundance comes from. So for over 30 years, the Just Harvest has affirmed the need for our need to be in relationship with those that we serve, and that we are committed to our ultimate purpose, which is to work until all have plenty and no one is left in need. While we remain agitated by the fact that here we are, we've been open since 1983 as a mission of a church and now a nonprofit. Here we are all these years later, and we're still feeding hungry people. And we're agitated by that because we do believe that God is a God of abundance and God has provided enough. And so why is there hunger still in our communities. And so really began to have these conversations in a way that says, we're not going to do this because we feel good about it. We're not going to keep doing this because it's the nice thing to do, but we're going to do it in an intentional way that makes sure we're here in our community, that we're centering our community, but we're also making sure that we're ending hunger and poverty in our community. So beginning to look at organizing and looking at community and economic development. And so our mission is to fight poverty and hunger in the Rogers Park and Greater Chicago community by providing nutritious meals daily, while cultivating community and economic development and organizing around racial, cultural, and socioeconomic lines in order to create a more just society. And we do all of this grounded in a spirit of respect and dignity for our community. And our work is grounded on a set of values, and these values are feeding hunger, which, you know, we literally feed the physical hunger experienced by so many that come to our community kitchen. But we also feed the hunger of those that are stirred and compelled to serve and to do something and to be God's love in the world, to create community, to be in fellowship, but also to change the systems, the why people are hungry, to address that why. Another value is building power. And Dr. Stephanie, as you know, from our class that we just co-taught, that power is the ability to act, to get things done. We all have power. And as people of faith, we're called to act against oppression and injustice and to stand up and speak up for the least of these, which I don't like that language either, and engage in work of transformation and restoration. Understanding that God has given us each a spirit of both love and power, A Just Harvest wants to be a powerful organization led by committed people of faith, made up of those that we serve, those in partnership with us, and all who seek justice, so that we can improve our community and be effective in this fight against hunger and poverty. Because we believe that the richest, no one should be hungry or poor in the richest nation in the world. A third value is seeing beyond. At A Just Harvest, we see beyond a world with hunger. We have this vision. We see beyond brokenness and despair, and we believe that a new world is possible. We see beyond economic policies and political systems that create and perpetuate poverty and vast economic inequality. And we proclaim a vision, again, and a future where all have plenty and no one is left in need. We see the potential of people, and we see that there are gifts that are there. And when you're trying to survive, it's hard to thrive. And so we're seeing beyond where people are now and really tapping in and calling out the gifts that are already there. And not that anybody isn't enough as they are, but really, it's like Brian Stevens says, they're more than that thing that they've done. They're more than that choice that was made. We are more than any circumstance we've gotten caught up into. And we're certainly more than Corona, amen. And finally, getting to the abundance part, the final value that I want to share and spend a little time on is our value of cultivating abundance. Cultivating abundance. We are called to be good stewards and co-creators with God. There is enough for everyone. And God desires that we live and operate out of the spirit of abundance and not lack. And it just always reminds me of the story of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and how we talk about the miracle, right? And I know some folks have pushed it, that the miracle really was that folks started not being afraid to share their stuff, right? Not being afraid that if I pull out this sandwich, everybody gonna want some and it ain't gonna be enough. But the miracle was that there was the mask again of being afraid or this lack was removed, and there was an ability to make sure that everyone was fed. Cultivating abundance means that we can share our resources and we will be okay. We can begin to consume less, as we've learned through COVID-19, and we will be okay. And we can take better care of one another and the earth, and we will be okay. Cultivating abundance means that we can all prosper. That is to be whole, healthy, and able to live a life of dignity and well-being. And we can each fully live into what God created us to be and proclaim it all good. A friend of mine once said that this idea of cultivating abundance is simply Jesus's message of share our stuff. Now, he used a different word, but I'm going to say share our stuff. And we know, for those of us who call ourselves Christian, we know that Jesus has called us to break down the walls that would have some folk poor and some folk hungry and others not. And I often say this when people ask about why do we organize or why would you get involved in works of justice, and I always go back to Jesus was not crucified because he was doing what I consider for some the safe work of feeding the hungry. Jesus was crucified because, yes, he fed the hungry, but also called into account the systems that were put in place to keep people hungry, not just the government systems or the empire, but also the religious systems that were in cahoots, right, and keeping people poor and hungry. And so I also like to, when I think about cultivating abundance, I think about the story or the text where Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And so when I think about that text, I think about the thief. And I believe that thief has two parents. And those parents are lack and greed. The thief that has come to only steal and kill and destroy is the offspring of lack and greed. The thief that has stolen our joy because enough is never enough is born of the seed of lack and greed. The thief that is killing our communities before COVID, and if we don't get our shit together, he's going to be here after COVID, because disparities have our children fighting over corners that they will never own. This has been nurtured by lack and greed. And the thief that is destroying our economy, causing the poor to be poor while the planet is ravaged to satisfy the few, this thief has been raised by lack and greed. And as Dr. Angela mentioned, the poverty that we're talking about is violence, Before any gun is picked up, before anything else happens, before any bat is picked up, for those of us who used to use bats in our fights to not kill nobody, before any of that, any violent act is had where we think about it physically, poverty has already ingrained itself into our communities, and we need to put an end to that. And we're committed to that, and we're called to that. I believe that a theology of abundance calls us to dismantle those systems that keep our people hungry and poor, and to tell a different story, to tell a story that even though I've experienced hunger, that I still had worth and that I mattered. And that even though saying yes to my call making some decisions that affected me financially, connecting to community as you see happening now with this COVID-19 crisis allowed me to experience that and not be beat down by it, right? And not be overcome by it. And so I think that right now, before COVID-19 and after COVID-19, we have to make sure that when we're thinking about a theology of abundance, that we understand that is us sharing our stuff, but also us calling to account those systems that keep people hungry. So that means, we serve people every single day. We haven't missed a beat since COVID-19. Thanks be to God, and thanks be to our partners that help us in this work. And we're delivering groceries, doing hot meals to go. As one of the presenters mentioned, a hot, nutritious meal, because nutrition is so important. We're not feeding our folks scraps. We're not feeding our folks stuff that a restaurant, didn't want to throw away. We're not feeding our folks something that somebody can sell. These are hot, nutritious meals that we make with love and serve with respect to our folks. But alongside that, we're also fighting for a fair tax. We're also fighting for a living wage. Yes, we want to make sure that folks who should have access to government programs have that access, but we also need to we have to close the income gap, right? And we understand that that's what we are called to do. And a theology of abundance calls us to make sure that we're not just talking about how much is out there and that people should be able to access it, but being able to talk about the why and being able to talk about the systems that keep people hungry. At A Just Harvest, we operate from what my mentor, Dr. Carruthers, calls a theology of sufficiency, right? Abundance, for me, when I think about abundance, it's like, yes, there's enough, but then when you talk about sufficiency, it's like knowing it in your spirit, knowing it in your being that what God has given us is sufficient. It's different than an abundance, which might seem like more than enough, which is amen to that. But sufficient is like, yes, I have all that I need. And so with this understanding, we ground our practice of engaging around assets of the community as so key to what we do. Not assuming what people need or assuming what people want or looking at folks and just making a determination, but really engaging with community and beginning to talk to folks from, what is it that you want? What are the gifts that you want to bring to this work? What are the, and it's not enough to say, go get a job, but what are the gifts that you have and how can we help you create your business, right? So looking at the assets that are in the community and to affirm that aside from the forces that I've mentioned earlier, the community is able to be healer. The community as healer. I don't know if y'all can see the sign back here, but it says belonging, community as healer, as one of our board members, Dr. Walida Bennett, shared with us, that if we are going to begin to shift our theology, shift our understanding of our relationship, not just with God, but with one another, that we have to begin to understand that the healing that we're seeking, we can begin to generate that together. And so our overall vision statement at A Just Harvest is cultivating a world of abundance and radical belonging. Cultivating a world of abundance and radical belonging. We're really, again, pushing against this idea that there's not enough food, let's figure out how to get it to people, and really pushing back on the idea that what we really need to do is create this sense of enough and a shared enough, and understanding that that we are responsible for one another's well-being, right? And it starts with people knowing that they matter and knowing that our sense of well-being and healing and connection really is important. And so I'll end with this one little thought that we've been kind of building on and leaning into here at A Just Harvest, is that if we want a safe community, then all must have enough to eat, earn a livable wage, access meds if needed and as needed, and have a place to truly rest. If we want a beautiful community, then everybody, those serving, those being served, everybody must know dignity and respect and have a clear sense of belonging and be truly, truly seen. If we want to be well, our community must be well. And thinking about Jesus as agitator and liberator. And then we talk about freedom. We need to be free from control and the spirit of lack to be the community that God is calling us to be, community as healer, because we have everything that we need. And this is an opportunity for us to go back to that. And again, it's not this kind of Pollyannish kind of thing, but it is a pushing against, this understanding that for the communities that we serve, that it's always like, what do they need? How do we serve them? Or calling folks the less fortunate in that kind of language. So we talk about a theology of sufficiency or a theology of abundance. We also have to think about our language, right? And how we're talking about our relationship with one another, with the communities that we serve, and the communities that we say we are called to help heal. So I hope that added a little bit of light to this conversation from a different way. I want to just say one more thing, one of the things I'm trying to do a little more research on. There's a Black farmer that I heard present once that really helped us to understand that to think about food as the access to food and what we're able to eat and what we're able to purchase, that control of food is very intentional, right? That control of food is a way to control community. So the other thing, again, going back to this asset-based and community as healer, is conversations with people how to grow their own food. Not because, not trying to right or wrong what they were already doing, but giving folks another sense of agency, right? And not this relying on everybody from the outside who don't always have the best interest of the community at heart. So yes, COVID-19 has helped us to come back into stronger community, and that this theology of abundance really is reliant on community, and also kind of reinvigorated us in this fight to end hunger and poverty, so that our folks can thrive, right? To live this abundant life we've been called to. So, that's a lot, I know.
No, it was perfect. It was wonderful.
Too fast.
No. This is wonderful. I really appreciate how you wrapped us around the importance of paying attention to the language that we use. Because I was struck, and you talked a little bit about it, but I want to ask you to go a little bit further. So the things I wrote down were we can generate our own healing, a theology of abundance, also a theology of sufficiency. We have what we need. So I have that kind of set of comments. And then I'm remembering earlier in your conversations, you said, I don't like the term the least of these, right? Can you just say a little bit more specifically about the challenge that you're offering us around language, and particularly when we happen to be in a position to share what we have and not referring to people as the least of these?
I just think that I struggle with it, but not because I have another alternative. I struggle with it with the same way when we say from the ground up or from the top down. I think we perpetuate sort of separateness and class, or all those things by our language, and so that's why using the word disenfranchised, right? Communities, I think it was Dr. Angela that had disinvestment, right? It's putting the onus on the system and not on the people, right? When you call them least of these, and I know that's in the Bible, but we all know that, there's, for those of us who are not literalists, when we say least of these, there's always this kind of like, In Spanish, we say ay bendito, which is like saying all poor baby. And I'm of the mind that, and I've been called mean because I push, but I'm of the mind, all poor baby ain't gonna help nobody, right? And so language really matters in how we refer to the communities that we're serving. To say the least of these, or some people say these little ones, and the people these are grown ass people out here hungry and trying to make like in the old ways you would say $1 out of 15 cents, right? So we're not gonna baby them, we're not gonna sweetie them, we're not gonna try to pacify their situation when it's all messed up, right? And it doesn't mean that we ought not be kind and gentle, and I'm working on that. But yeah, I would never refer to the community I'm serving as the least of these.
That's so powerful. I think I'm also thinking there tends to be a habit that if you have something and someone doesn't have it, then you give to them because they don't have it, but in a way that doesn't allow them to be mutual. And not only are they not considered mutual, there's no reciprocity. And so I'm tying that back into when you say we generate our own healing. When we offer what someone needs, there's a position that they can come into that they then can offer to someone else, right? And so I think your language and a bit, all three of you all have kind of offered kind of propositions to kind of shift some things for us to think about community, right? So we never think about the person who may be at that time in need as someone who's going to be at some point, or who at another point previous to now had been able to offer to someone else. And I think that's a piece of this dignity piece that all of you all are hitting at, that we never know where someone was before we met them at that moment, nor do we know who or where they will be in the future to impact someone else. So I think that's the human dignity piece that I'm hearing from each of you all. And I'm bringing us all kind of back into this collective conversation. I think there's been some questions that have been shared. So let's get into some of those questions that I believe have been popping up. I believe that, Dr. Barber, can you handle the pitching of some of those questions?
Absolutely. I've shared a question, and I'll start with Dr. Angela. Wondering what you would suggest for stakeholders in communities with food access and security, right, in terms of some concrete ways for them to engage with building and reinvesting in communities of the greater need. And I know some things have been mentioned by both by Dr. Valerie and Dr. Marilyn, but I was wondering your perspective on that.
Yeah, and I actually enjoyed both of the presentations. And as you see, I'm taking notes because I think one of the things that these types of forums do is that they start to speak, you know, truth to power, you know, the idea that we're having a conversation about this and generating ideas. And there's been several of these during COVID, honestly, that we probably would not have had before COVID, virtually, that people can engage in, because technology can be an organizing tool and a way to mobilize people and engage in advocacy as well. So I think one of the things that's happening already is that communities are mobilizing and working together to think about how do we address some of these issues. I think the key is not only being in a silo, but also looking at across class, across race. We, in my mentor, Dr. Shariki Kumanika, some years ago, they started a national group called the Council on Black Health. And one of the things at the last conference that was mentioned is America really ready for Black people to be healthy? And I have the same comment about the West and South Side narrative. It's almost, and I think Dr. Marilyn mentioned this, is that we really have to envision a time that the South and the West Side is not going to be in the situation where we can always sort of point in a more social service way and say, we're going to help the West and South Side. And Dr. Valerie also mentioned that with the Food Depository and their great work around not just making sure that people that are experiencing hunger get food, but also looking at the root causes of hunger. So part of that is in building institutions, looking at the institutions that we have, a lot of faith-based institutions, is to organize and think about how to both advocate as well as organize for both policy change and structural changes. So I'll give a really good example, honestly, and brag on Trinity United Church of Christ, because that is my church, is Imani Village. If you have not heard about Imani Village and what's happening, that Trinity is developing, doing a planned development that's nearly 30 acres at 95th and Cottage Grove. And part of it is really thinking about taking the institutions that we have and supporting those institutions and really coming together as communities. But we can't only do it with people that are only quote unquote impacted, because we're all impacted. People on the north side are impacted. People on the Gold Coast are impacted. Maybe they don't realize how, but we're all working on this together, and we can't fall into that same narrative. Oh, the poor South and West Side, or we got to help the South and West Side, like the people are, as Dr. Marilyn said, kids. It's not just, you know, these are high capacity communities in the sense that they have withstood a lot of disinvestment and oppression. And so how do we come together and use those very strong assets that people have in these communities and work as a collaborative to mobilize? And I think technology, honestly, is the key. Youth do a very good job. Now, I have a teenage daughter. She knows people in other places that she would have never known if the technology of Instagram and these other technologies did not exist. I think we need to figure out how to leverage these technologies across generations. And we can do that through forming both participating in groups and forming new groups that include both youth and adults. And so part of it is just figuring out, somebody has to start that. I think our existing institutions like churches, like other types of civic organizations can be at the center of that, to look at new programs and approaches to advocate, but we have to do that across generations.
Thank you so much. We are hearing a pattern here, but let me continue. Dr. Valerie, your question, thank you certainly for connecting dignity, as already has been said, and transformation in this work, and then concrete avenues of engagement through the Greater Chicago Food Depository. Could you say more about the educational pieces or the content for the educational pieces that are available and that can help better inform and prepare people to engage in the opportunities?
Yeah, there are three or four things that come to mind. The first one is a partnership with our health systems and community health centers, where we go in and we work with these agencies to screen for positive for food insecurity, and so that working with the members of the community and the health systems to really identify areas of food insecurity is an educational piece, understanding how poor health is impacted by poverty, which is impacted by the food insecurity. The fresh truck that I talked about, which is the produce mobile, educates our community on how fresh fruits and vegetables can add to a healthier lifestyle. As I said earlier, a lot of people may not choose certain kinds of vegetables that are not familiar with, just simply because they don't know how to cook it. And so providing recipe cards, actually doing demonstrations, which is a part of how we work with pantries, giving people, taking down that shame of not knowing how to cook something just because maybe historically it has not been in your lexicon of food items in your household, but introducing it in a way that's engaging. And I love what Dr. Marilyn said about mutuality and reciprocity, right? So I may have cooked beef, but I shouldn't shame you because you've never cooked beef, right? You may have cooked kale and I've not cooked kale, but kind of creating a community around learning in that regard. Another area is around what I broadly call workforce development, and is the Chicago Community Kitchen, which is that 14-week culinary program, but we're also building out the same opportunities for the warehouse and back of the house, front of the house in the culinary program. So we had recently some training front of the house around with barista kind of training. So folks would understand how to learn how to serve coffee, tea, so that they can perhaps find themselves in that industry versus maybe the back of the house culinary piece. And then I think the last one is, and I think I talked about it, was the cooking classes at the pantries. We do some some sessions that are about an hour long. We go over nutrition, food groups, salt, sugar, fat, special diet needs, and we really take people through an understanding of the nature of food. So there's also perhaps an opportunity to participate and maybe even volunteer in that area. I think the one other thing is, as I was listening to the speakers speak, was really kind of helping to dispel this myth of who is food insecure and who's not. And we do try to do a good job of that when people come in to volunteer. And we not only teach them how to repack, but we share with them stories so they can understand a lot of what all of the panelists have said, that just because I am in need of support right now doesn't mean I will be, and just because I am doesn't mean I have always been. And so really, that's the biggest educational piece that we really work to do, is to dispel this myth of, the poor and the hungry, poor them, but that it could be any one of us. That's why I really like what Dr. Marilyn talked about with this mutuality and reciprocity. And I really like the question, is America ready for Black or Brown America to be healthy? which Dr. Odoms talked about. Because if we think about that context and we think about how we educate people, then I think it will help dispel these myths that we have, but it also prepare people to engage in work outside of their communities. So if you go into my community, we deal with the food insecurity and we address systemic problems, policy problems that suggest that America is not ready for Black and brown people to be healthy. Then we continue to address what keeps them impoverished. Right? And so I really like that, because it's not just about handing you a bag of food. It is about addressing the root cause of your poverty through food resourcing, through policy, through education. And then if we do not address some of these other policy issues around employment, the workforce development, or education, how we hem people up with loans for them to go back to school. If we don't address all of those collectively, then we really are just feeding hungry people. And we're really not solving the longer term problem of building people up so that they can stand on their own and stand for and with their community. So those are a few of the educational pieces that we engage in.
That is awesome. This is a extremely rich dialogue. So Dr. Marilyn, one question for you, and then I'll hand it back to Stephanie. You've named this thing of values, right? And of being and of doing and mutuality and reciprocity. I'm wondering what you might say, what's needed on the ground in faith communities to help interrupt, whether it's greed and et cetera that you talked about, so that we can live more fully into a theology of abundance and for impact and sufficiency. That's the first question. And so how do we interrupt some of the, whether it's the narratives? What are your thoughts?
In case you saw me shaking your head, I was telling somebody not to come in. I didn't want them to interrupt. The very first thing I would say is to be in relationship, right? And so we intentionally, when we talk about the faith communities, most of our partners do come from faith communities. And their heart is to want to serve and to follow that aspect of the call as a Christian. But we were very intentional about making sure that our relationships are transformational and not simply transactional. Not here to do good work, not here just to receive your charity, but to be in relationship together, even as there is need and ability, right? A need and ability are there, but again, how do we have a conversation so that we are both transformed by the work, right? And when I've been here 17 years, and when I first got here, I came with the intentional mindset of having conversations with our partners, which are mostly North Shore congregations, not all, but mostly. And we got pushback, especially from the organizing world, about why are you organizing with those rich folks? They don't need your organizing. And my response was, poverty is not a poor person's problem. We are not here to fix poor people or fix poor communities. We have to change the system. And if we're going to change the system, we got to talk to people who don't have resources and people who do have resources. We have to talk to folks who don't feel like they have any influence and those who are very clear about their influence. And I use the analogy of racism, right? If you want to do work that's anti-racist work, then you have to talk to the training. I went through the anti-racism training, and they're very intentional around doing anti-racist work and then also doing work around internalized oppression, right? And again, racism is not, you don't fix people of color. Racism is not because we have a problem. It's a societal, systemic thing that has to be addressed. And so really being intentional about that, having those conversations, using an anti-racist economic justice and a love lens, right? And I don't mean love in this kind of mushy thing, but this love that says, I love me, I love my people, and I also love you. And if this world is going to work and be as God imagined it to be, then we're going to have to talk to each other. We're going to have to agitate one another. We're going to have to fight, and we're going to have to see one another. And so really getting rid of the shame, like really being able to see that even that rich person that I had a conversation with, it's not about me making a judgment about them, but knowing their hearts and then beginning to allow the change that some of these changes only God is going to make, right? But if we're not even willing to have a conversation, we're impeding the possibility of transformation, right? And so, yeah, that's where we start. And I did want to just add, and I don't know if this is part of your question or not, but how to, again, in these conversations, helping folks understand, we want people to have enough food every day. And so I am grateful for the outpouring of community love and gifts and all these things that we're receiving and everybody else is receiving around making sure nobody goes hungry. But we don't want to create this feast to famine, right? And we don't want to create a system where we're going to respond in this time of crisis, but because we haven't changed anything, once the crisis is over, and I'm putting that out there because I'm praying it's going to be over, people still going to be hungry and poor. All that generosity, if we don't systematize it and organize the change, then, people go back to work, people go back to business as usual, and the same folk who were hungry, them boxes go, people can be hungry, right? And so how do we make sure that we're constantly saying, yes, thank you for this meal today, and let's also, so that tomorrow you won't have to bring over a meal.
Now, this is awesome. You're now speaking to long-term recovery, which Dr. Stephanie is going to speak to. So I'll turn it back over, and some of you may have more comments, and I think we have a comment in our chat as well. Dr. Stephanie?
Yes, so what I'm struck by is all three of you are talking about not only a systemic view, right, but the importance that the view does no good if we aren't also committed to systemic change, right? And so I was kind of thinking about toying with the concept of theology of generosity as transformation, right? Like it won't be enough for us to just be generous in this moment. And a theology of generous transformation also requires that we see people, right? That we see people fully having a generous approach to one another, as in being open to giving and receiving, which is a significant paradigm shift that each one of you have addressed. And I think it's so powerful. One of the things that I think is also great about this conversation in particular is how it is also encouraging and affirming some of the things that Dr. Barbara and I have been talking about the next few webinars and where we want to spend our energy and time. And in April was very much focused on, we have got to talk about trauma as an immediate interpersonal existential crisis and how to get through that. And we've also continued that in the month of May. As last week, we talked about financial insecurity and how to survive through that. Not just survive it, but survive through it. It is a thing to come through. And then today we're also talking about food insecurity and also transformational change that sustains a theology of abundance and sufficiency that has the capacity to impact generations to come, right? That whole question, Dr. Angela and Dr. Bella, that you all asked, is Chicago ready for the South and West Side to be well? That was such a powerful statement. But each one of you have spoken to the importance of activity and agency, right? And so this kind of really is affirming as we're also thinking about the webinars that are to come. And we're really thinking about now making the move to talk about what does it mean to sustain oneself as we work in groups and institutions, to be well and to be tuned in enough to your own sense of calling in this moment and the role that sense of calling has to play in trauma, but also as we conceptualize trauma within the context of disaster response and disaster preparedness. And so those are the kinds of things that we're going to start seeing in the webinars that are to come, is this kind of shift now towards what I love Dr. Barbara calls movement building, movement work, right? That if we're going to do movement work, there has to be the systemic view and the systemic responses that you all are talking about, but there also has to be what I call self-care in community, practices of self-care in community as people are discerning their role to play, as some people are awakening. This may be their first go round, realizing that this is the time and this is the place now to act and to become engaged with others. And for those who have been in the game for a long time, right? And this is a community that's really important. There's an assumption that for those who have been actively engaged for a long time around organizing, activism, the various sectors that you all come from, if you are seasoned in this process, that you don't also need a space for discernment, that you don't also need a space to grapple theologically, talk about what does self-care need to work and look like now, and also a space to strategize, to receive some information that can support the strategic work that is required for movement work. And so thank you so much for each of the lenses that each one of you brought as we think about how this symposium can support, can be a place where people can come and to receive beautiful conversations and information. It wasn't just information you all that you offered. You all created a kind of a space for some deep processing that has the capacity to help us think about what do we want the future to look like, while at the same time addressing the needs right now, right? And it's not often that we're able to do both. So I think you all have exemplified a moment and a model for how to be clearly responsive right here and right now, but to recognize that the now is related to a then and will certainly impact the next, right? And so we're so grateful for all that you all have offered in this space and during this time. I think we might have a question over here. Oh, and also I see a thing. And actually, this may be a really great way to pitch to each one of you all for a closing thought. For each one of you, for the things that you brought up systemically and interpersonally, from what you do on a day-to-day basis related to this topic, what are the ways that people can create opportunities to be accountable with one another around what they're doing? And feel free to go with it, whoever would like to go first, or we can go in the order. But I know that was a new question, but I was just thinking, you know, this is tough work. And we kind of need some people to walk alongside of us, to encourage us, to affirm us, support us. I just wondered what that may look like from each of the perspectives that you all brought this morning.
Yeah, I'll go first, if you don't mind. You know, I sit here also as a theologian and a clergywoman, and I think about in my favorite, Tupac. You know, there's a line in Brenda's Got a Baby. It says, "Let me show you how it affects the whole community," right? So this notion that Brenda is a teenage mother isn't isolated in her family, but it has a ripple effect throughout the whole community. And so when I think about all of what the panelists have talked about, I wrestle with the question of, in particular, the Black church, because also what I hear is this notion of giving and receiving. And so in the work that I do, sometimes people say, well, we want to come and volunteer as a method of doing good, as Reverend Marilyn said, Dr. Marilyn said. I would suggest that there be some deep thought around shifting the paradigm from just doing good to really understanding the root cause of why our people are in poverty. And whether it's addressing the social structure of the church itself, that's going to require you to be bold and contrarian. But think about that, and think about the people in the community, how we're not serving them, but we are working collectively together. We are one people who, as you said, may have the issue today, may have the issue tomorrow, or may never have the issue, but we are one people. And so I would say for those who sit in spaces and places called the church or the church house or the Black church, whichever one sounds more aligned with where you find yourself, is to push against and rail against this idea that we do charity, that but that we really need to challenge structural powers, whether they're in the church or whether they're in our communities, that say, and speak truth to power and recognize that you are going to lose some things. But in the losing, the people who need it gain. And that's what I think about when I think about the work that we do.
Wonderful, beautiful.
I would just say first, ditto. 100% agree. I think many times if you are not walking alongside the people that are experiencing the issue and making sure that their voice is heard, we have to, even though we may feel as if we are doing good, part of the doing good is giving up power. Many times we don't always think about the fact that we have power. And so part of it is really you have to give up power for people to gain power. And even though we may point to larger structures, some of that we can do within our own context. And if we continue to talk alone, we are talking to ourselves. You come on a webinar, or you might end up doing a presentation, and it's so important. And I do community-based participatory research to think about how do we co-create knowledge. We can't just value one type of knowledge. I think the second thing is something that I grapple with personally, honestly, and it comes from, growing in faith and spirituality, and that's fear. Because to be bold in spaces and to do work that may not always be acceptable and socially acceptable, because people don't like giving up power. They don't want to give up. I think going back to the question, are we ready to see the West and South Side well? We need to really, that means a shift of power and a shift of resources. And so sometimes we have to speak that, and that takes not being afraid. So I think the other thing that we need to, the way that we become more bold and brave is through also working with each other and joining with each other, because we can feel stronger when we work together as a community than when we work alone. And so I'll close there.
Beautiful.
So I know we're almost running out of time, but 3 quick thoughts. One is, and I think Dr. Ray preached this a couple years ago, and it stuck with me, is when we're talking to our congregations, the way we can hold each other accountable. It's like, especially those of us who are Christian, we're called, Jesus came so that we might be free, not just make progress, not just kick the can down the road, but to be free. And so, what are we really willing to do to make sure that we're all free, right? And think about Jesus' conversation with the rich man. He had all the right answers. He knew he was following the law. And then when Jesus said, sell everything and give to the poor, that was a whole nother thing, right? So it goes back to what Dr. Angela and Dr. Valerie said, what are we willing to give up? Which takes me to the last thought is Paulo Freire wrote in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is that even the well-intentioned folks, those of us who really want to do this good work, are often the ones in the way, because we're gonna do so much as long as it doesn't mean I'm gonna be uncomfortable or have to give up something or some way of living so that all might live, right? Those of us who are, we're not always willing to do that. Let me just say that. And so we're going to do so much, but not go that far. And so this idea of asking the question, I love New Amsterdam asked the question, how can I help? But not help because you need my help and I'm the one to give it, but how can we collectively help, not just address hunger for today, but actually really end hunger. And so be willing to ask the question and be willing to hold ourselves accountable and have our community hold us accountable to the answer, right?
Beautiful.
Yeah, and you know what?
He said he's running
know we
outside
have
the door.
I know we have to end, and you know, I just thought of this as Dr. Marilyn was speaking. You know, we think how can and Dr. Valerie talked about that, the word help. You know, help doesn't only mean it doesn't mean just the volunteering. It means advocacy. So the idea, like, instead of saying how can we help, well, how can you advocate? You know, how can you be how can you be how can you help raise the voice of those folks that may not have a voice? You know, how can you make sure that they're at the tables that otherwise they wouldn't be at those tables? And I think that's help is advocacy, not just handout.
I love it. Help is advocacy. I couldn't find a better place for us to end. We need to honor our time. Dr. Wilson, is that a good place?
Phenomenal place, yes.
Thank you so much. Dr. Angela Odoms-Young from UIC, Dr. Valerie Tony Parker from the Chicago Food Repository, and Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagan-Banks from A Just Harvest. You all have been amazing. Thank you so much also for our participants. Please keep an eye out on emails for updates for our next conversations, and perhaps also a survey on what you would like to hear talk about.
Yes.
Take care, be well, talk to you soon.